The mother who forgot her child is a sweet journey between two women, a mother, a child, who have lost each other in memory and time. The work opens with the silence of a suburban house, where the mother lives as if there is still something to remember. But then, each piece of handwritten letter, each unspoken question, leads them back to each other, not to mend as if there had never been a separation, but to live with that rift with slow and courageous love, with a delicate, honest and profound writing style. The story raises a heart-wrenching question: when memory betrays, can love still guide the way? Margaret Hale lived alone in a small white house with a grey roof at the end of a cul-de-sac on the outskirts of Waconda, Illinois. The house was built in the 1970s, and the brick walls were stained with moss on the back porch. But Margaret kept it as clean as if someone might stop by at any moment, though no one ever did. Her mornings began with making coffee, watering the lavender pots on the windowsill, and tuning in to the local radio station to listen to the traffic news. She didn't go anywhere, but she liked to listen to what roads were blocked, who had accidents were a meaningless but consistent routine. The kitchen was where Margaret spent most of her time. The floor tiles were worn but shiny, and the smell of rotting wood mixed with the scent of cinnamon from scented candles made the place warmer than the other rooms. She would cut fruit into small pieces and arrange them on a plate as if serving it to a child, though there was no one to share it with. Every Monday morning, she called her brother in Florida, asked about the weather, told him about the long-tailed squirrel digging for nuts in the backyard. Her brother was always nice, but always in a hurry. The call ended with a familiar line: "You should go somewhere, meet someone. It's not good to stay home." Margaret would smile faintly, nod, and hang up. But she didn't go anywhere. In 20 years. She had never left the suburbs more than 30 miles. No close friends, no church groups, no community activities. No one asked her much, just the mailman, the grocery store owner, and the neighbor who occasionally mowed her lawn. Margaret liked the silence. She had been a nurse, had lived through the noise of emergency rooms, bright white lights, and constant calls of names. Now she lived in silence, choosing to forget something, even if she didn't know what it was. The first letter arrived Wednesday morning, amid the junk mail and the water bill. The white envelope had no return address, just Margaret's address, scribbled in a sloppy handwriting in dark blue ink that looked like it had been written with an old fountain pen. She opened it in the kitchen, stirring a pot of oatmeal. There was just one line, written on a sheet of school-grade paper: "I miss you, Mum." Margaret sat down on the chair, spoon in hand. Her heart skipped a beat, then slowed unnaturally. Not because of the word she thought someone had sent it by mistake, or some prank by the neighborhood kids. It was the feeling that came immediately afterwards, something vague, like an echo from the bottom of a well. She didn't remember having children. She was sure of it. If she had, she would remember. But why did her hands shake? Why did the words make her put the spoon down on the table, go out onto the porch, and breathe deeply as if she'd just weathered a storm, for hours afterward? She left the letter on the kitchen table, untouched. She tried to throw it away several times, but decided against it. At night, she tossed and turned. Her sleep was interrupted, and for the first time in years, she dreamed of blood. A long hallway, flickering fluorescent lights, a baby crying from the last room. She walked toward it, but the door was closed. When she woke up, it was 4:13 a.m. She turned on the light, went down to the kitchen, and looked at the letter again. I miss you, Mum. Each word felt like someone was tapping at her memory with metal. The next morning, she took the letter to the local police station, saying someone was playing a prank on her. The young officer glanced at the letter, frowned, and shrugged. No obvious threat. Mom. Probably a bad letter. Margaret nodded and left. But from that day on, she began checking her mailbox every day, earlier than usual, and she began to write in her diary again, not to remember, but to find out what she had forgotten. 3 days later, a second letter arrived. This time it was longer, 5 lines, written in the same blurred handwriting I remember when you braided my hair in the morning. Do you remember when I had a fever and you sat by my bed all night? I still have the blue handkerchief you used. I won't bother you. I just want you to know I'm here. Margaret sat motionless for a long time, the paper in her hand, her eyes fixed on the last line. I'm still here, like a voice from the distant past. She didn't know how she felt, confused, scared, or empty. The strangest thing was that, although she didn't recognize any of the details in the letter, they weren't unfamiliar, like a song she'd heard in her dream. The name you echoed in her head all that day and all the next night. Margaret began unpacking boxes of old things in the basement, a place she hadn't been in for more than a decade. Each box was clearly labeled hospital records, old photographs, nursing supplies. In one unlabeled box, she found a pair of small pink wool mittens and a worn child's coat. She didn't remember ever owning them, didn't remember ever buying them, washing them, or wearing them on anyone. But when she put her hand to her chest, her heart pounded so hard that her throat tightened. She sat in the basement for hours. The yellow light from the old ceiling light, not enough to illuminate her emotions. Margaret didn't cry, but she knew something was melting deep inside like thick ice cracking under the pressure. When she emerged from the basement, it was dark. The wind blew through the bare trees outside, whispering incessantly. She set the coat on her lap and sat down in the old armchair by the window. In her mind, a sentence appeared, out of nowhere. Her name is Alice. The next day, Margaret got up earlier than usual. She made coffee but didn't drink it. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, laid the 3 letters side by side, and read them over and over again. She took out her diary, wrote Alice at the top of the page, and sat still. The name, strangely, was familiar. It had been repeated all night. She remembered hearing it, saying it in her dreams. But when she tried to remember the face that accompanied the name, her skull was blank, as if a part of her mind had been erased. Margaret hadn't seen a therapist in years, but that morning she called to make an appointment. Dr. Wendy Blake had treated her for a while after the trauma that had caused Margaret to quit her job. They'd never talked about specific memories. Margaret had always claimed she was just overworked. But Wendy had never quite believed it. When Margaret called back, she was not surprised. I thought this would happen, Wendy said, and I already have an idea. The appointment was in a quiet consulting room in the center of town. Wendy was a quiet woman, her voice low and her eyes soft. Knowing the design of the person opposite her, seeing the uneasiness. We're not going to find answers today, she said as she began. Let's start with what you felt when you read that letter. Margaret told her about the dream, about the basement, about the coat and the name. Wendy invited notes. "Do you remember being pregnant?" Wendy asked. Margaret was silent for a long time. "No," she whispered. "I don't remember that, but I remember a white room, and crying, and someone taking me away. And then, nothing." Wendy had run out of words. "You told me you had no family, never married, never had children, but I always felt like there was something you were avoiding." Margaret nodded, not disagreeing. In that apartment, she admitted something for the first time. There was a hole in her life, a shallow void, and now, someone, maybe a child who once called her mother, was trying to fill it with memories she had deliberately forgotten. 2 weeks after seeing Dr. Wendy, Margaret began to receive letters every Monday. No one's name, but she knew it was Alice. The letters were not praises, not complaints, just little pieces of memories. A birthday cake with a cat-shaped candle. A rainy afternoon when mother and daughter ran through the backyard in the same raincoat. An old English lullaby she had hummed. Margaret couldn't remember the tune now, but the warmth remained. Slowly, things Margaret had thought had been erased began to return, as if someone could slice the screen up bit by bit, without pressure, without pain. She remembered the name David, her dead husband, a tall, charming man, but with a sharp gaze and a sweet, angry hand. She remembered being pregnant, hysterical, alone, and giving birth to Alice on a winter night in the local hospital. But the memories of the years that followed of Alice growing up, of whatever event had caused Margaret to abandon her child, remained like a thick swamp, growing more and more obscure the further she entered. On a rainy afternoon in late October, Margaret decided to walk to the town library, a place she hadn't visited in more than 10 years. She asked the massage therapist for old newspaper records, looking for news related to her name from 25 years ago. After some searching, she found a short story from the local paper in 2000, Nurse Margaret Hale hospitalized after obesity accident that resulted in head trauma and temporary amnesia. Patient admitted to long-term care at a nursing home outside Springfield. She guarded the person looking at the attached black and white photo, a thin, disheveled woman, her eyes seemingly not looking at the camera. It was her. She was saying something but couldn't make a sound. Margaret could no longer deny it. She had lived another life, had been a mother, had been so damaged that her mind was incapable of denying the existence of her own children. Not because she had not loved, but because she had loved so deeply that she could not bear the loss. When she came out of the library, the rain had just stopped. Red leaves were scattered on the labels. Margaret stopped by the bench, her hand trembling as she picked up the nearest letter from Alice. She read each line again, this time not just with her eyes, but with her heart, which was growing more and more aware. In the afternoon light, for the first time in years, she whispered, "Daughter." Margaret sat in the living room that evening, holding her new diary. She wrote not to remember, but to talk, to herself, to Alice, to the smell that had returned after so many years of hiding. The writing was slanted, halting, as if each sentence required a deep breath to continue. "My dear, I don't know what I did all those years ago. I don't remember who took you away, or who took you away, but I do remember one thing. I held you in my arms, and I thought I would protect you at all costs." The next day, she decided to write back. She didn't know where to send it. She had no address, no name, but she wrote anyway. The letter was 2 pages long, recounting the fragments of memories that had returned, the feeling of finding the little coat, of reading the old newspaper. She apologized, not for any specific action, for she still wasn't sure what had happened, but for her absence from Alice's life. "If you want me to, I'll be here, just to hear you out, even if you don't forgive me." Margaret took the letter to the post office, put it in an envelope with no recipient, just to Alice. The postal worker looked at her, frowned slightly, but didn't ask. Perhaps they were used to the old woman living alone sending letters of any kind. On the way back, Margaret felt something in the traveller's heart, like an old wound being bandaged for the first time, letting light in. 3 days later, when she was relaxing on the porch, a young woman stood at the gate. She was wearing a light blue coat. Her brown hair was slightly curly, and she held a cloth-covered notebook in her hand. She said nothing at first, just looked at Margaret for a long time. A look that was not angry, not impatient, but filled with the apprehension of someone who had just travelled a long way to the door of someone's house that used to belong to her. Margaret stood still. She didn't ask for the name. It wasn't necessary. Something inside her confirmed it immediately. The look, the helpful look as she stood. The way the girl pursed her lips, a habit she could not remember having, but knew well. She stepped closer, without the scent of gold. "Are you?" Alice, her voice was a breath escaping into the morning air. The girl nodded, tears welling in her eyes. They said nothing more, didn't hug, suffocated. Just there, a step away, and the thing that hadn't been named for 25 years was finally there. Alice came every early afternoon, never more than 1 o'clock, never stepping into the house. They sat on the wooden bench on the porch, the wind blowing and the smell of mint from the hedgerows. Margaret brought hot tea. Alice brought the window. She didn't write anything while she sat with her mother, but invited the window to open, to leave the pages alone. "I need time," she said on her 3rd visit, "and I think you do, too." They didn't dwell on the past, not yet, at least. Each meeting began with little things: the weather, the smell of cookies in the supermarket, a stray cat that had wandered into the backyard. But there was a new tenderness to those little things, like they were learning to be present in each other's lives again, without breaking anything fragile. Margaret didn't ask why Alice had found her after 5 years of dying, afraid of the answer. And Alice didn't say much about her life either, only that she had been raised in a foster home in Wisconsin, had studied art, now worked for herself, and lived in a small apartment near town. One rainy afternoon, Margaret brought out 2 small umbrellas. They sat in the rain, each holding one, like 2 separate hemispheres. Alice laughed. "I remember you said rain isn't scary. It's just water from the sky." Margaret laughed along, softly and shakily. She didn't remember saying it, but when Alice repeated it, it rang close, like the memory wasn't lost, but just temporarily hidden. The silence between them wasn't heavy, but rather like the space needed to write. Once, Alice asked, "Did you ever think about looking for me?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked out at the lawn, her voice hoarse. "I didn't know you existed, but I think, somehow, I've been waiting for you." The words made them both quiet. It doesn't mean Chu-Loi, nor health. It's just a single truth, standing in the middle of eternity, today. When Alice got up to leave, she gently touched Margaret's shoulder, a brief exchange that made her heart feel as if someone had owled her in for the first time in years of silence. She didn't pull, didn't call. She just stayed there, her hand on the spot, still warm, like a promise that didn't need words. One early winter morning, Margaret received a small package on her doorstep. Inside was a hand-painted picture, framed in a simple wooden frame. There was no one in the picture, just an old kitchen with the early morning pouring in through the door. A round wooden table and 2 chairs, warm colors, intricate details, the cracks in the tiles, the inflatable tablecloth, the steaming cup of coffee. Margaret recognized it as her own kitchen, looking straight out of the window where Alice still sat. Behind the picture was a note. Even if my memories are incomplete, I can still draw them. That's how I found you. Margaret sat for a long time, her fingers tracing the glass of the frame. She didn't read it. There was no need. There was something about the picture that gave her a silent confirmation that even though she had left, forgotten, Alice had kept the pieces and was now putting them back together. The following week, Alice agreed to come in, without warning. She followed Margaret into the kitchen after tea and sat down on the chair, the same chair in the picture. Margaret was teasing, her hands running lightly, trying to hide. "Can you show me the old albums in your room?" Alice asked. Margaret got up, went into the living room, opened the wooden cabinet where she had not been for many years. She took out a transparent plastic box. Inside were old photographs, most of them blurred and faded. They sat together, flipping through the photos. There was a picture of Margaret in a white nurse's uniform, a picture of her standing next to a tall man, David. But Alice did not ask who it was. When she came to a small, faded photo, Alice stopped. A little girl was around, with curly hair, standing next to a chain in the park. "Is that you?" she asked. Margaret looked at it, not answering right away. Then she nodded slowly. "I think it was you. I remember that afternoon. I bought strawberry ice cream, and you distorted the new dress." Alice smiled. "I hated strawberry ice cream when I was little." They laughed softly, like 2 old friends sharing an old story. During the process, the distance between the 2 short hairs did not disappear, but it receded, giving way to something new, softer and more commercial. No longer mother and daughter as traditionally defined. 2 women who had lost each other, now finding something close to kinship, not through blood, but through presence. Margaret stood up, poured more tea. For the first time in her kitchen, there was a real person sitting. Alice drew. Margaret read. They did not talk much, but that afternoon passed like a quiet river, without a clear direction, just 2 people traveling together in the same small boat, on a December afternoon, with a light snowfall. Margaret and Alice sat in the living room, wrapping Christmas presents, a system of communication they had never shared, but were now experimenting with. Alice had brought some handmade items, incense, handkerchiefs, and a small drawing book. Margaret had a homemade cookie and a few old favorite books. They wrapped them, labeling them with names of people they both knew, not many, but enough to make the room feel warm. Margaret noticed Alice's choice of wrapping paper light blue, minimally patterned, and the meticulous way she had put the labels on. "Who do you do this for every year?" Margaret asked, her voice soft as mist. Alice perked up, smiling faintly. "Some to foster homes, some to friends, but this year, I think you should be the first one." Margaret fell silent, feeling her throat tighten, not the words, but the tone of voice. Not angry, not cruel, just gentle, as if it were fuel. Together, Margaret put her hand on the small gift wrapped in old newspaper, a photo she had developed from an old film camera. Alice, 4 years old, grinning with a face full of cream. She wrapped it for Alice herself, without explanation, just as a way of saying, I still have you, even when I don't know I do it. As the afternoon wore on, as Alice was about to leave, the autumn fell more heavily. Margaret stood by the door, holding her coat to protect her. A small, familiar gesture. It made Alice pause. I used to do that every time you went to school, she said. Margaret didn't remember, but she believed her, and for the first time, she touched Alice's hair, an instinctive, feather-light gesture, and whispered, Thank you for coming back. Alice said nothing. She just stood there for a long time, and then hugged Margaret. Not the placidity of a first meeting, but the embrace of two people learning to forgive, not just for each other, but for themselves. After Alice left, Margaret did not turn on the lights, just sat in the dim light, looking out at the snow-covered backyard. There were losses that could not be reversed, wounds that could never be completely healed. But in that silence, she felt something she had not felt in 25 years, the presence of someone, real, close, and not going anywhere. The last month of the grey distant days. Margaret had grown accustomed to Alice's presence as a part of her daily life. She didn't always come. Sometimes she would be gone for a whole week because of work, but when she did, Alice knocked exactly as she had expected, 2 short taps, 1 long tap. Margaret had gotten the sound she had been waiting for. No fever, no impatience, just the comfort of knowing she was still near. One morning, Margaret found another letter in the mailbox, this time written in her own handwriting. Not from Alice. It was from a woman named Clara Jennings, Alice's foster mother. In the letter, Clara said that Alice had never stopped looking for her mother. She didn't blame you, Clara wrote, but she carried that question with her throughout her childhood. Although we loved her like our own, I think she will need me to find the answer someday. Margaret read the letter, running her hand. The letter was neither excited nor demanding. Just another woman who had been Alice's mother in her absence, now handing over some of that role not with power, but with trust. Margaret wrote back, briefly. She thanked Clara and said she didn't know if she deserved it, but would try her best to let Alice know she wasn't lost. Alice came over for the weekend. She brought a small wooden box, which she handed to Margaret without saying anything. Inside were letters she had written to Mother during her quiet childhood, never sent. Some were drawings, some were scribbles from her 8-year-old days. Did you know I had school today? Mummy, I hate math. Do you hate it? I'll find you, I promise. Margaret read step by step, without responding. She had found a part of her life in the words of a child she wasn't there to hear. I wish I was strong enough to answer each one, she said, taking Alice's hand. But if you will, I will start now. Alice did not answer right away. She simply nodded, resting her head on Margaret's shoulder for the first time, like a child finding support without words. Neither of them said it, but they both understood this relationship would not be perfect, not complete as if there had never been a separation, but it could be real, and that was the only thing that mattered. As spring came, the rose bushes on the windowsill began to sprout green. Margaret and Alice spent more time in the backyard. They planted vegetables, tilled the soil, rebuilt the old fence, small tasks that required demonstration and coordination. Margaret found her hands, accustomed to medical instruments and hot tea, now firm with the pick and shovel. As for Alice, she became less alert, no longer constantly checking her phone or looking around as if she were afraid something might disappear. One Sunday morning, while tilling the soil, Alice stopped and looked at her mother. I used to think, Mum, I would ask why she said it without bitterness, without demanding, just like a question that had been hanging around for years. Now it was out. Margaret put down the bay and sat down on the ground. I ask myself that every day, she replied. I don't have a neat answer. I just know I'm broken, like a frame that no longer has a shape. Alice nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. I don't need you to explain. I just want you to stop. Margaret took her hand. I won't say no, never again. Every afternoon. They sat looking at the drawings Alice had brought. This time, they named each one. One was called Imaginary Breakfast, showing two women eating eggs and toast in a sunny kitchen. Another was called Mother and Child at two ends of a bridge, showing two small figures who could stand on either side of a wooden bridge, a ford between them. Margaret stopped at the third, where the two sat leaning against each other, in a white field. What's the name of this one? She asked. Alice smiled. I haven't named it yet. You name it. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she whispered, Stay. Alice looked at her mother, her eyes downcast. Think of a suitable name. From that day on, they no longer counted time in days or months, but in moments that did not require progress. The short nod when making more tea, the shoulder grip when standing together in the kitchen, the awkward silence when sitting together on the porch. There were no great expectations, just companionship, something that both had lost long ago and could now be found again in the slowest way possible. Summer came quietly, without noise, only with longer light and earlier noise. Margaret and Alice had their own rhythm now. Tuesdays were for cooking together, Fridays for the farmer's market, and Sundays were wordless days, an hour spent drawing, reading, or sitting still, saying nothing. Not to avoid it, but because it was time to understand each other without words. One day, in early July, Margaret took Alice to an old house near Lake Geneva, where she had lived as a young woman. She had not been there in more than 3 decades, but this time, she wanted Alice to find a part of her memory that she herself had only just begun to piece together. They walked down the cobblestone street, stopping in front of a red brick house with bougainvillea draped over the windows. Margaret pointed to the porch. You sat there, 3 years old, with a teddy bear. I remember because you dropped it in the pond and cried all afternoon. Alice asked nothing, just put her hand on her mother's. That touch was no longer hesitant. It was affirmative. On the way home, they didn't play music, didn't talk, just listened to the sound of the car rolling and the wind blowing through the open window. In the midst of that scene, something, old sadness, fragmented memories, was behind, as light as a dry leaf blowing against the wind. The last week of August, Alice moved into a small apartment 5 minutes' walk from Margaret's house. Not to live with her, but to be closer. I still need to be alone, she said. Alice nodded. So do I. But now, being alone doesn't mean the same thing anymore. One morning, as the sunlight streamed through the window, Margaret opened her old library, took out a leather-bound notebook, and handed it to Alice. I wrote it for you, from the moment I started remembering. Alice opened the window, saw the line slanted, some clearly erased, some whispered. A page marked, "You were here," before I knew it, and I am here, if you need me. It finally happened. One gentle evening, two women sat on a wooden bench on the back porch. No need to turn to each other, no need to touch. The yellow light from the window illuminated half their faces. Two figures, not separated by lost years, but joined by presence, forgiveness, and nameless love.